Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Equestrian Tea Time. I am your host, Isabeau Salas. My co host is Emma Jenkinson. And today we speak with Becki Oberg, who runs boldequine.com up in the Alberta, Canada area. Becki, Emma, and I discuss Becki's childhood experience growing up with horses in Alberta, Canada. She started training horses professionally when she was 18 years old. She talks about what she learned by observing the wild horses in her native Alberta area and how these observations of wild horses compare to the observations of behaviors of our domesticated horses. We discussed the topic of consent in horse training and Becki's setup for allowing horses to opt in or out of her training processes. We also had a very lively discussion about boundary setting among professionals in the equine industry and a number of other topics. You can find Becki on TikTok. She also has a website, boldequine.com. And you can find my co host, Emma Jenkinson, at emmajenkinsondressage.weebly.com. She teaches classical dressage and mindful horsemanship for all. Thanks for listening. So, Becki, I think Emma is familiar with your work, so she's going to
Yeah,
take care of most of the questioning.
awesome.
Yes. Hi, Becki. I'm so honored to meet you. I've just been watching your TikTok for quite a while, and I just love everything you have to say. And I was definitely on my journey, like starting to learn about positive reinforcement and just trying to decide how to use all these things together. And you've really helped me out. So I'm very excited to have you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
I just want to start off with you telling us a little bit about yourself, your program, and how you came to become a horse trainer. Whatever you'd like to share on that.
Sure. My name is Becki Oberg. I run a company called Bold Equine. I got into horses as a child. I grew up on a farm in rural Alberta. Horses were just kind of what we did in our spare time. It was just part of our lives. When I was 11, I got my first training project to train on my own, start to finish. And the rest is kind of history. My dad is an auctioneer, which privileged us to be able to bring home whatever didn't sell at the auction and sort of just have resell projects and sort of a thing. So as I got older, I got into reselling projects and then catch riding, that sort of a thing. And then at 18, I got my first gig training at the facility that I boarded at in exchange for board. And then it kind of just built up from there. But it was always something I did on the side, training and teaching lessons and that sort of a thing. And then when I had my youngest, actually, when I was finishing up my mat leave, we decided that I wouldn't go back to work. And I took horses full time. And that's when we started our company. And now we offer full training program for developing horses and rehabilitating horses. That's a lot of what we do is helping rehabilitate horses that have experienced trauma. But we do like coaching lessons. And then we're also focusing a lot now on educating and empowering owners. So we have both in-person and online coaching services. We travel around doing clinics. Every year we have like a big retreat that is all about educating, giving an all-around education for horse owners. And then recently we launched the video library and membership subscription online as well.
That's awesome. Becki, you know what I know about Alberta? I follow HAWS, the Help Alberta Wildie Society. Do you know those folks at all?
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, we have beautiful wild horses here. Beautiful wild horses that are kind of under threat right now. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's been so interesting to see what they learn just about the horses by putting the cameras out there. I see stallions raising orphan foals because the mare gets chased off by a bear or walks off a cliff. Horses surviving with really significant injuries and managing to be able to still go on. I think there was even earlier last year a foal who might have gotten a broken leg and still managed to survive somehow, whether the luck of the draw because the time of year. And horses living alone. I didn't realize any horses would wander around by themselves alone, but there are some bachelor stallions who maybe they have a friend for 6 months and then they don't have a friend for a year. But they're actually single horses kind of wandering out there by themselves. So it is quite the horsey area you've got up there.
Yeah, there's a stallion. We haven't seen him in a long time, but he's called Scar, and he's actually missing the majority of the muscle in his hind end on one side. He lived through that, and it's quite a privilege. I wish people would get to experience to just spend time with wild horses, because so much of what we think we know about horse behavior is based on domestic horses that are in these dysfunctional artificial environments. And so we base our training on that behavior. So we're actually basing our training practices on dysfunctional behavior that isn't actually natural horse behavior.
Yes, the stories about the horse does this because this or because that. That's definitely the road to hell paved with good intentions. Emma, are you ready for the next question?
So I just love your TikTok account, and you do talk a lot about consent and its importance in training. You've actually really helped me kind of figure out how I can offer that in my program, along with important things that we have to do to keep our horses alive and use positive reinforcement. And you've also been accused of gentle parenting equestrians who ask questions on there, and I love that. And so you just really have a really lovely way of reaching people who might not otherwise learn about the science-based practices or horse behavior. So can you tell us a little bit more about your views on consent and its place in training and husbandry, especially in your programs?
Thank you. That's very sweet. I try my best to gentle parent. I think that the conversation around consent is an interesting one to have in the horse industry. We tout ourselves as having these deep, meaningful relationships with our horses, and we call them our friends, we call them our partners. And yet, when we really sit with ourselves and kind of have a look at those relationships, most of them are pretty one-sided. We talk about having horses as these, willing partners in sport. And yet, if you bring up the idea of consent to horse people, the idea of allowing a horse to say no, they look at you like you have three heads, which is wild. The idea of being nice to a horse is controversial. But if horses aren't free to say no, we can't really ever be sure that they're saying yes. If we're not sure that they're saying yes, then it's not really a partnership or even a good basis for a relationship. We can't say, well, the horses are doing these things because they want to, because we're not really, in most traditional training practices, giving them the option to say no. So how can we really say we're having a real relationship with these animals at all if consent isn't a part of that?
So true. And it's kind of, hard to figure out what behavior we are seeing if we don't give them a say in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if, some people say, well, my horse never says no to me. Well, then how do you know he's ever saying yes? How do you know that he knows he's allowed to say no?
It's a really excellent point. And I have seen you just kind of show us on your TikTok some of the things you do at your property to offer consent to the horses you have in training. Could you tell us a little bit about just a few ideas on ways to add consent to your training?
Yeah, I'm sure. I think I've made at least one TikTok I can think of right now showing our setup. So we set it up so that our working space, every space that a horse would live in, has a gate that directly opens up into our working space. And so by doing that and setting it up that way, we can allow our horses to opt in or choose not to opt in to the training. So basically, we do sometimes go out and catch them and seek them out. But for the most part, I'll arrive, I'll start getting my tack and equipment and everything ready for the day. And usually by then the horses have noticed that I'm there. And so they come over and they just kind of hang out either in the working space while I work, or if I want a little bit of space and privacy, I'll close the gate and they'll just wait at the gate. And then that way you can just, when you're done with one, you can just let them out and then open the gate, and whoever wants to come in next can do that. And we can leave the gate open as well, so that if at any point, and especially at the beginning of training, I try to do as much as I can at liberty, so that if at any point the horse just goes, I'm not interested in doing this, I don't want to do this, they can just go, I'm done, and they can just walk out the gate back into their living space and be done. And that's such an important part, especially for these rehab horses that have experienced trauma.
So cool.
And allowing them, the biggest thing with consent is your reaction to them saying no. So you can present them with a question. And for a lot of horses, I take anything that isn't enthusiastic participation as a no. So you can present them with a question and they kind of go, I don't know if I want to do that. And you can choose to just take that right there, or you can say maybe break it down or change it a little bit and just offer them again and see if they say, well, maybe. And then if you ask them a second or a third time and they say no again, then you just have to go, okay, that's a no for right now. Whether that's I'll ask them again later in this day, or that's just a no for the day, depending on how much no there is in that answer. But the biggest thing with consent is your reaction to the no. The no just has to be a full sentence. Like you just accept it and it's safe and it's comfortable, because it's not really allowing them to say no. If you say, oh, you can say no, for example, with a Liberty horse, you can say no and you can leave me, but if you leave me, you have to run. That's not a safe and comfortable option. So just making little changes like that.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Really monitoring them. Like even when if we're talking negative reinforcement practices, trying to eliminate or minimize the escalation so that we're not punishing for non-compliant. And then even within positive reinforcement, when we're doing our clicker training, being really cognizant that we're not being coercive with our rewards, especially if we're using food rewards, because this is a grazing animal who is hardwired to seek food. So making sure, for example, I have one of those buckets that hang on the fence. And so whatever food reward I'm using, put that food reward freely available in the bucket. So if they just wanted the food, they can go get it from over there. They don't have to get it from me. And really monitoring for our horses for any stress signs or signs of tension or calming signals or anything we see that the horse is maybe extending themselves in an effort to either please you or get the reward. It's kind of like children. Like we kind of have to monitor them and make sure that we're making good choices for them, because they're not always the best at making good choices for themselves. And they're wired to fit in. Like they're wired for non-compete and to comply, right? So to be non-confrontational. They're wired to just go, yes, like they're so hardwired to default to a fawn response if they're stressed. Because they're a herd animal, they require fitting in to be safe.
Yeah. Becki, as long as we're talking about the no, one of the most useful things about the no that I think people don't talk about so much is that for me, the reason why it's so tremendously useful is the horse is giving me feedback on what I just did and whether it is useful, makes sense, doable, etc. So for me, the big value in the no is the feedback that I get, that what I just thought was okay or doable, the horse says, actually, no, you're on the wrong track. It's almost like the horse playing the hot cold game with me now. The horse is telling me, no, I'm getting feedback, which is very useful in the long run.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you want to talk about, spending time with horses and especially riding horses safe, like allowing your horse to go, no, that's not a good idea right now, is probably the best thing you can do to keep you and your horse safe. Because don't wait until it's a problem and your horse has to scream and shout no and try to save itself. Like just allow them to go, maybe not right now. Maybe that's not a great idea. And allow them to tell us how to train them.
Yes. And some horses require, just things you didn't think would be hard. They need you to do a million tiny steps at. And that's just for whatever their issue is, that's just them. Whereas other horses, I have a jumper background, and you get really talented jump train horses, and they can be hopping around, within a very short period of time with a skilled rider. A lot of them can be jumping a 3-foot course in like a month because it's just not hard for them. They're so balanced and they're so talented. Another horse, that may take you a year, a couple years. It's kind of easy to see it when you're talking about that, but it's a hard pill to swallow when you're talking about, it's going to take me a year to get my horse to go in the wash stall. That's difficult. That's difficult to deal with just as a person.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest kind of hurdles for people when we talk about consent and allowing the no is this fear that they have of, well, if I had allowed him to say no, he would never say yes.
Yes.
But I actually find the more you allow them to say no, the less they actually say it. And now, don't get me wrong, when you first start, if your horse hasn't been allowed to say no, you first start letting him say no, that's the only word in his vocabulary. He will want nothing to do with anything. But the more he sees that you see him and understand him and that you respect that, the more they say yes. And this was tough, even recently, probably 4 or 5 years ago, when I really started to commit to consent. And I was already at the point, I have these Liberty horses that I think I have this great relationship with. And I decided I wasn't even going to take a maybe. Like anything other than enthusiastic consent was going to be a no, starting from approaching these horses and catching them. And when I tell you it was a hard pill to swallow that I spent an entire summer, I couldn't even put a halter on one of my Liberty horses. They were just like, absolutely not. No, I'm not doing anything, actually, if that's the option. And they'd be like just running circles around me, where like they would just walk out there and they'd come over to say hi, and then you'd lift the halter and they would just kind of give a little bit of a calming signal or something. So I'd go, okay, I guess not. And for an entire summer, I couldn't put a halter on a horse to catch them in a way that I liked. And these were my horses that were Liberty horses. Like,
yep,
that's
I believe that.
Punch in the gut of like, oh, okay, well, I guess we see where we're sitting. Like, it was tough.
Yeah, that's definitely where you actually form a real bond with your horse and learn their specific behavior, though, is like giving them that opportunity to communicate with us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then it's funny because it's when you start working with a lot of the consent and the relationship stuff, you don't even have to do any of the quote unquote training. It just kind of everything just worked. Okay, sure. I'll do that for you. And it's just no big deal. My assistant joked once because somebody was just angry on our TikTok and commenting about, however it's all a scam because it shouldn't take more than 2 weeks to get any horse broke and blah, 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 blah. And how it's such a scam because obviously we just don't do anything with the horses. And I was pretty affected that day by it. And she was like, well, the problem is they're kind of right. As we're just sitting there like hanging out with all the horse training horses. And she's like, problem is they're kind of right. Like, we don't have to do all of this chasing around and get them all sweaty and do all these hours and hours and hours and hours of work because the horses are just at a place where they're just willing to do whatever we ask them to do. And it's never a big deal.
Yeah, it's very cool. It just takes time and it's not that quick horse training we talk about. But I'll tell you, I just got 2 Mustangs in who went to a 90-day trainer and came back with rope burns and now they're untouchable again. So things like that, it can work for some horses, but sometimes we get actually bigger problems that we have to undo.
Well, that's the thing. They think it's so much faster because they do it in 30, 60, 90 days, but then they spend the next 20 years of that horse's life, if it's lucky enough to stay sound that long, fixing all the problems and putting out all the fires that they created by starting those horses in 30, 60, 90 days. Not that it can't be done. Like, I mean, I get horses in that they're so engaged and so smart and that they go very, very quickly, but that's not the average horse. Most of them just sort of manage to make it through. And then they, like you said, they end up creating way more problems and end up in the long run spending way more time trying to
and
fix
as you were saying, there's a huge difference between domesticated horses and non-domesticated horses and their experiences that they've been through. I don't doubt that there's well-adjusted horses who go to training to learn to start under saddle in 90 days, but sometimes it's really rough for those horses.
Yeah, and how many of those horses do we think did really well that are just either stuck in a shutdown or stuck in a fawn response where they've just adapted to the level of stress they experience on a daily?
So I think this next question is not in line in the red order, but it goes perfectly with what we're talking about. What's your view on how we can help horses through mental traumas or accidents?
I mean, the best thing we can do to help horses with trauma is be trauma informed. Learn what trauma is, how it affects the brain, the nervous system, how it stores in the body, so that we can be really empathetic with the ways in which it affects our horses. And the biggest thing I wish people would understand when they're helping horses through trauma is understand that trauma is a wound, like a real physical wound that happens in the brain and happens in the body. Trauma, depending on the severity, can alter your brain and your nervous system permanently. Like if you do an MRI, you can see the trauma. It's an actual wound. Yeah. And so if you were to have a horse tear a tendon and the vet come to you and said, this is our plan to heal this tendon. It's going to take 10 months or 12 months or 14 months. We're going to have to back all the way down to ground zero of just hand walking them for a few steps at a time. It's going to take time and work and effort to heal this wound. And you might have to adjust your expectations because it might not ever heal right. We would see that as being completely normal. And yet when we look at trauma, people bring you traumatized horses to get trained or retrained, and they'll go, okay, well, we'll give him what he needs and take the time it takes, so long as it doesn't take more than 6 months because, or 3 months, because I have this thing that I want to do. And I have this goal. And they don't realize that, like, your horse has a wound that needs to be healed, and it might not ever heal, right? Depending on if it's a small trauma or a trauma with a capital T. And the first step in that, of course, is establishing a new relationship with that animal that has consent, because most horses have trauma that has an element of having their consent violated and not having control over what happens to them. And then, of course, maybe making husbandry changes and providing them with a really supportive, balanced herd environment. My resident herd is absolutely invaluable when it comes to rehabbing horses through trauma, because they need that. They need that support. They need those social relationships to just even help their nervous system get back to a functional place. And then just being working really hard to expand our knowledge and our skill at being able to be aware of and notice stress and tensions and calming signals and stuff like that, so we can determine the specific triggers that this horse would have and sort of work through healing them as best we can. But it's a journey and it's a process.
It is. And I think that's a lovely explanation. And some of them, they do just need to go out with the herd and be horses for a little bit and get back to baseline.
We had one that she came and she was at the point where we considered just euthanizing her because she couldn't even just exist like out with a herd of horses. She had so lost her ability for neuroception, her ability to look at her counterparts and take cues to regulate her nervous system from them, that she couldn't even, if a horse moved, it was a threat to her life. If a horse swished their tail at a fly, she'd fall over bolting away, so scared. And we, for almost 2 years, that's all she did. We just turned her out and waited for her to just hit a homeostasis baseline of being a horse again. And some of them, we have some that came for rehab that they're just permanent residents here. They'll never leave because they will never be right again. So we can manage them as best as they can. And that's all we can do.
Well, I think that's awesome. And it's just that we are on their time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that it's all doom and gloom and undoable. Like I do lots of horses and some of them come around right away. I get some that you just be nice to them for like a day or two, and they are like, actually, you know what? People are actually great again. And they're so forgiving and magical that way that they just...
It's amazing how some horses are willing to turn a page and just move on. It's really impressive.
Yeah, you're nice to them for like 5 minutes and they're like, okay, cool. People are great again.
Right. And then I think there's also a factor of when these horses don't get better, they can't regulate their nervous system, period. Sometimes there's underlying health issues and we don't have as much feedback from them of even what's going on. It is hard to figure out what's going on with them. So we just try to support them.
Yeah. And I mean, so many of our domestic horses, I mean, they're packing around generational trauma at this point. And then their trauma starts when they're 4 to 6 months old. They get weaned incredibly early and usually fully abruptly. And that is just the start of the cascade of trauma that is their life. And then we somehow have this shocked Pikachu face when they turn out to be dysfunctional adults.
So you practice negative and positive reinforcement in your training. Can you tell us how you use both in your training practices?
Yeah, I think the reality is you can't really exist in a world and be interacting with it and not be using all 4 quadrants. I mean, it's just like classical conditioning is always happening. Anytime an operant behavior is expressed, unless there is a true neutral, one of the 4 quadrants is going to come into play. It would be nice if it was really simple that we could just pick one, just pick positive reinforcement and that's the only thing we ever use, but that's not really how it works. And I don't mean this as any shade, but I think anyone who says they only use one of them is either lying to themselves or just simply like unaware of every micro interaction that happens. And so I think it's really important that we don't allow our biases to push us to focus on using one or not using another. I think that does happen because most people come from a traditional background of negative reinforcement, positive punishment that uses it very poorly. And, we hold our own trauma and guilt and shame about that. So we want to distance ourselves from it. But instead, we need to kind of work through our own issues and then focus on using it really well. So if we're talking about using negative reinforcement, like I said earlier, trying to reduce or eliminate any escalation in the aversives that we're using, making sure we're really appropriate with the aversives that we're using. Negative reinforcement is like a huge factor in how horses interact with each other. Mind you, I'm not big on trying to model our relationships like as a horse-to-horse relationship, because horses are never going to look at us and see a horse. Also, I don't want a horse-to-horse relationship, because if I miss a bunch of cues and get out of line with my horse, I don't want him to think it's okay to kick me in the face like he would his friend. So
good point.
I don't really want him to, I don't want to speak horse to him, because I don't really want him speaking horse back to me. So I think when we're using, so I use negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement, and also the punishments as well. But just being really cognizant of how we're using it. So for example, if I were to use negative reinforcement, most of it would likely be on an energetic level, not so much on a physical level, which is how horses kind of communicate and use it the most. Is they very rarely ever make actual physical contact. That would be a pretty serious escalation in the realm of horses, to actually make contact with each other when they're using an aversive like that. It would mostly just be energy. And then the positive reinforcement, same thing, is it can be on an energetic level. It can be a scratch. It can be, holding space. It can be a food reward. Really just about, even if we look at, say I was doing a circle with my horse, and I'm going to give him a cue, and then I'm going to raise like a driving energy and create like a little cloud of driving energy and push him towards him. And then I would dissipate that cloud when he moved off. That would be negative reinforcement. And then I ask him to do another behavior, and then I bridge and reward that. That's positive reinforcement. If he comes over to get his reward and he's nipping and snapping and mouthing at my hand, and I just close my hand around that food reward and I take away his access to it, that's negative punishment. If he's doing his circle and he comes into my space and I just push some energy at him or wave my hand or whatever, that's positive punishment. It doesn't have to be the extremes we're used to seeing in the industry, because the reality is just that most of the industry uses the quadrants, particularly the negative reinforcement and the punishment quadrants. They use them so inappropriately and to such an extreme that we end up with this, we want to get ourselves away from it because we never see them used in an ethical manner. So a lot of times we don't imagine a way in which they could be used in an ethical manner, if that makes sense.
That resonates a lot. I'm thinking of like the, I don't want to name anything, the colt starting competitions where people start them in, yes. You want to see people use pressure release training. And it's kind of unbelievable what some of these folks do over the course of a day or two. But that's a really good way of putting it. We've seen it used in such extreme ways. It doesn't have to be used quite that high.
Yeah, it's not that negative reinforcement is inherently bad. It's just that pretty much everybody we see use it is bad at it. So that's all it is. And same as, most of the industry looks at positive reinforcement and goes, well, it's bad and it creates all these problems, but they're just looking at people who are bad at using it.
Yeah.
Like, look at somebody who's good at using positive reinforcement. There's no way you could look at someone who is really good at positive reinforcement and argue that it doesn't work. We use positive reinforcement to make polar bears and elephants and rhinos safe to be around and cooperate in behaviors. So the fact that the horse industry thinks that it creates problems is just because they're bad at it. So they're feeding their horses treats, but they're not cognizant of how positive reinforcement works. So they're not aware of the behaviors they're rewarding, and it creates problems. So it's just that they're bad at it. And the same applies, for the other quadrants, the people that are using pressure and release negative reinforcement. They're just, doing it in an unethical way or creating problems or creating stress or whatever. They're just bad at it. That's all it is. They're just bad.
Yeah. It is. And then it's hard to find a good example of either or both. And once you've been taken away from one that you've known your whole life, and then you go to say, learn positive reinforcement, then you're surrounded by people who only want to discuss that, only want to use that. And that's great if you want to use anything. But I just think that all of it has a lot more to do with consent, energy, feel, and timing.
That's their own trauma, right? They carry the guilt and shame of using it poorly. So they want to distance themselves as much as possible from those methods. And so they just have some work to do around that. Yeah.
And I think that really answers the next question about how do we use the 4 quadrants and learning theory ethically. So my next question is, what advice would you give younger you on your journey to becoming a horse trainer?
Be an architect instead.
A doctor.
Just be literally anything else. It'll be so much better for your mental health.
Do it. Don't do it.
Yeah, don't do it. It's a bad idea. But just be humble enough to listen and listen well enough to learn. You know, I was your typical 20-year-old horse trainer at some point that could sit anything and thought I was the bee's knees and God's gift to horses at some point in my life. And then I was very much humbled with a broken back.
Oof, ouch.
So
really?
And then it was kind of like a wake-up call, you know, and now I wish I could go back. And that's why sometimes I get so frustrated watching these younger trainers who I see myself in them so much because I was so that person. And I just wish I could shake them and be like, can you just get your shit together before you destroy your body doing this stupid stuff? Like, and learn how to set boundaries much better, much sooner. I think that the industry would be better off and the state of the mental health of a lot of horse trainers would be better off if they could set boundaries because, I mean, I don't want to get into this rant too much. It's really off topic, but I think a lot of
it's equestrian tea time.
Yeah, a lot of the reasons. A lot of the reasons why, you know, we don't see industry changes and we like to put it all on the trainers, but these trainers are impoverished in their service and they're just trying to put food on the table and pay the bills. And they're under immense pressure from their clients to get results. And so they have to stick to these unethical training practices and try to smash as much training into horses as they can in 30 days because otherwise they don't eat. And if they could learn to set a boundary and just say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to put your horse at risk or my body at risk. If they could set a boundary around getting their bills paid, I don't know any service provider that gets paid on time. I think if you could, as a young trainer, learn to set clear, strong boundaries and keep them, like your life will be much better.
Yeah.
And you're not a crash test dummy for hire. Like,
no. Wish I learned that 10 years ago because same broken back. Broken things. I am now struggling with like an autoimmune disorder and heart problems because of all the stress and what I did to my body.
It's a rough time. It's a rough job to have.
The boundaries are no joke. Em and I are both on a Facebook group for barn managers and owners. And the number of problems that just come back to people running businesses, the no personal boundaries, you know, for some reason, people who own farms or run boarding barns don't think they have a right. Is it okay if I tell my client no? Like the very, very baseline issues that we have in the industry are so people not being able to have boundaries.
Like horse people are so bad with understanding like boundaries to service providers of. Yeah. I think part of it too is like, because we're all horse people and this is such a personal thing for a lot of people, I think sometimes too, they forget like, we're not just friends. Like this is a business. I'll have clients phone me at 1 a.m. or Christmas morning. I'm like, what could you possibly need from me at 7 a.m. Christmas morning? Like, what are you doing? You know, like all of that. The boundaries get blurred and you really have to learn to be comfortable just saying no. Like it's took me a long time in my career to just be able to go, you could just go somewhere else. Just go somewhere else. There's someone else that will give you what you need, but it's not going to be me. And you have to, unfortunately, it takes a while to get to that point because like I said, most service providers in this industry are impoverished in their service to the industry. So they can't say no because if they say no, they lose their farm and they don't eat.
The free market and horsemanship are a very tough combination. I lived in New Jersey for 20 years and the area I was in was just so overserved. There were way more stalls than needed. So many people had built facilities over time. People can always leave. Clients can always leave. And it's almost a joke. Trainers go down to Florida and come back up to a different farm every year. And I've known boarders who go to 11, 12, 13 boarding barns.
We had this spring, we had to clear just about all of our clients out because I'm not great at setting boundaries. And
it's hard.
I kind of get, you know, you give somebody an inch and they take a mile sort of a thing. And I'm a sucker for trying to help horses. And they were shocked because, I mean, we had almost all of our clients. Some of them were 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 14 months behind on even covering their basic board costs.
Whoa.
And it's Alberta. So we had 30 horses last year. the hay was $200 a bale for a round bale, and we fed a bale a day.
Mm.
And they're not even covering the cost of their feed at this point. And we did that for the whole winter until finally we just said, we cannot do this. And it just blew their mind when I'm like, we spent $20,000-$30,000 this winter feeding your guys' horses. And it's like, it just never occurred to them that
Yes.
what it costs to, and that's not even talking about the keeping the waterers running and the cost of the land and the labor and turning the tractor on and, the minerals and the feet and the, it's not even including all that. I'm like, we're just talking feed. And unfortunately, it kind of ruined it for everybody a little bit, because after that experience, it was like, I don't even know if I want anybody else to be here, because what do you do, right? When you get into a situation like that, of just trying to help. And it just happened to be the perfect storm of, we had a lot of these trauma rehab cases, and that we're going to take, it was one of those ones that like, we might be for a year and you might not even be able to think about sitting on this horse at the end of it. And so, we had said, I don't mind helping you with the training. I can't guarantee I'll make a priority of it, because I have to make a priority of the paying customers. But so long as you cover their basic care costs, then we'll help you out with the training and figure out what we can do for you to pay for it or donate it to you or whatever. And then they didn't even do that. And then we just had some clients.
Oh, wow.
So many of our clients just had their lives just fall apart in the last year, like all the rest of us. And we are starting to open spots up again. We're just being very careful about who we allow in the door now.
Good for you.
And we actually might make it where eventually, once the library is to a certain point, where basically you have to be a member to bring a horse, because you have to get it. You have to really understand what it is we do before you bring your horse here. Otherwise, you're going to feel like you wasted your money, and I'm going to feel like I wasted my time.
All right. We're coming up on an hour here. Emma, did you have any more questions there?
No more questions, but if you'd like to tell us a little bit about your online program, because it looks super cool, and just tell us where we can find you for training and the online program and retreats.
Oh, great. My favorite part. Like my hands are sweaty. I have such a visceral reaction for being asked to like promote myself.
Promote yourself, Becki. Dance, sing, tap dance, do backflips.
I got a lot of hay to pay for.
Yes, you do. Yes.
So they can go to boldequine.com. So BOLD equine.com. From there, they can find out about, our development programs, coaching clinics, the online video library that we just released, which is great. It's got we're putting on some case studies that are going out. We have how-to instructional videos, and then the science and theory videos as well. So you kind of get a well-rounded education. We also do once a year, we do something called Beyond the Ride, which is like a week-long education retreat. You can find all the information there on boldequine.com. And then social media, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, all of that. Bold Equine or Becki Bold on TikTok is probably the main. TikTok is at this point the main social media that we use. So that's where they can find me and all the things that I do.
And do you offer any virtual coaching?
Yeah, we offer virtual coaching. So you can either submit a video and have it, voiced over and sent back to you, or if you have the ability to live stream from where you work your horse, you can do that as well. I also travel for clinics. So if anybody's interested in hosting a clinic, there's a form on the website. They can get a hold of us for that as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Becki. I just really appreciate it. And I would love to have you back to discuss a little more in depth about probably energy. I think that's just such an important topic.
For sure. Thank you very much for having me. This was great.
Thank you, Becki. It was awesome to meet you. I've been avoiding TikTok. I have to give in at some point here. And,
get on there with me.
You only got a month left.
I know. I only have a month left. All right, Becki. Thank you.
It was great meeting you guys.
The record out
you
now.
As well.